I gave my son $2.3 million for his wedding. 6 months later, at the reception I paid for, in a venue I paid for, wearing a dress I'd bought specifically because his fiancée had asked me to match the quiet elegance of the color scheme. I overheard her tell the wedding planner something that stopped me cold at the edge of the dance floor. "Just seat her wherever. She's basically a useless guest at this point. She already served her purpose."
She was talking about me, about the $2.3 million sitting in the accounts, the venues, the flowers, the 11-course dinner 400 guests were currently eating, all of it paid for out of a business I'd spent 38 years building. And in her eyes, apparently, once the check had cleared, my usefulness had officially expired. I want to tell you exactly what happened after I heard those words, because the wedding that day did not end the way anyone in that room expected it to, including me.
My name is Diane. I'm 69 years old, and this is the story of the most expensive lesson I ever paid for. And the one afternoon I decided that $2.3 million still bought me the right to be treated like a human being in my own son's life. If you've ever given everything to someone and watched them treat that generosity like an entitlement rather than a gift, stay with me until the end, because what happened at that reception still surprises people when I tell it. And if these kinds of stories matter to you, hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because I think it matters more than the wedding itself. I built a commercial cleaning and facilities management company from nothing, starting when my son Tyler was 4 years old, and his father had just left us both without so much as a note explaining why. Just an empty closet where his suits used to hang, and a bank account he'd quietly drained the week before. I cleaned office buildings myself in those early years, sometimes with Tyler asleep in a portable crib in the corner of whatever floor I was working on at 2 in the morning, because daycare that late simply didn't exist, and I couldn't afford to turn down the contract. I remember specific nights more clearly than I remember most of my 30s. The particular hum of an empty office building's HVAC system at 3 a.m., the sound of my own vacuum cleaner echoing down long, dark hallways, Tyler's small breathing from the crib in the corner, the only proof most nights that I wasn't entirely alone in the world. Over 38 years, that single-woman operation grew into a company managing facilities contracts for over 60 commercial buildings across 4 states, employing more than 400 people, most of whom I still know by name, including several I hired straight out of difficult circumstances, not so different from my own. Single mothers, people rebuilding after bankruptcy, a few who'd simply never been given a real chance anywhere else. I built the company that way, deliberately, because I remembered exactly what it felt like to need someone to take a chance on you. I raised Tyler alone through all of it. I want to be honest about the kind of mother I was during those building years, because it matters for understanding everything that came after. I missed things: recitals, a handful of parent-teacher conferences, one memorable Halloween where I showed up 40 minutes after trick-or-treating had ended because a client's fire suppression system had failed and someone needed to be on site immediately. I've carried guilt about those missed moments for most of my adult life, and I think, if I'm honest with myself now, that guilt shaped a great deal of how I responded to Tyler's requests once the company finally started generating real wealth. By the time Tyler turned 30, the business was worth somewhere north of $40 million, and I had, by any reasonable measure, more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Certainly more than I ever imagined possible, standing in an empty office building at 2 in the morning with a sleeping toddler and a mop bucket decades earlier. Tyler met Vanessa 4 years ago at a mutual friend's engagement party. She worked in luxury event planning, was striking, ambitious, and had a way of talking about her own future that always seemed to assume a level of resources most people spend a lifetime working toward. I noticed it early, the way she'd mention almost casually the kind of wedding she'd always dreamed of, destination, hundreds of guests, the sort of production that costs as much as a house in most parts of the country. I told myself, at the time, that plenty of young people dream big before reality tempers those dreams. I didn't yet understand that Vanessa had never once intended to let reality temper anything, as long as there was a source of money willing to prevent it from having to. I remember our first real dinner together, the four of us, not long after Tyler introduced her formally. Vanessa was charming, in the specific, practiced way people in her industry often are. She asked thoughtful questions, complimented the restaurant's wine list with genuine expertise, laughed easily at Tyler's jokes in a way that visibly delighted him. I liked her that first night. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters for understanding how gradually all of this developed. I didn't marry my son off to a villain in my mind that evening. I met a smart, capable young woman who clearly cared about my son. And I was, if anything, relieved that he'd found someone who seemed so put together after a string of relationships in his 20s that had gone nowhere. It was only over the following months, in small accumulating moments, that I began noticing the particular way Vanessa discussed money. Never crudely, never directly asking for anything, but always describing her aspirations in a tone that assumed, without quite stating it, that resources would simply appear when needed. She mentioned at that same dinner a friend's recent wedding at a vineyard in Napa that had cost, she said admiringly, just over $1 million, but every penny was worth it. I remember glancing at Tyler in that moment, watching him nod along, and wondering even then whether he understood what kind of financial gravity he was quietly stepping into. Tyler proposed after 2 years together, and almost immediately, the conversation around the wedding took a particular shape. Vanessa's parents, I learned early on, were comfortable but far from wealthy, a retired school teacher and a small business owner who could contribute, generously by their own standards, somewhere around $40,000 toward the celebration. Vanessa made it clear, in ways both direct and indirect, that $40,000 would cover approximately none of what she actually envisioned. I want to explain something about myself that matters here, because I think it's the actual heart of this story, more than the money itself. I have spent most of my adult life believing that love, expressed through generosity, was the way I could make up for the childhood I couldn't fully give Tyler during those building years. Every time he asked for something significant, help with a house down payment, an investment in a business venture that never quite took off, and eventually an enormous, sprawling wedding, some part of me answered not from a place of clear judgment, but from a place of old guilt, still trying, 25 years later, to make up for a missed Halloween. When Tyler first brought up the wedding budget, tentatively, almost apologetically, mentioning a figure around $800,000 for what Vanessa was envisioning, I remember feeling a strange mixture of alarm and, underneath it, that same old pull toward generosity I'd never fully learned to resist. Over the following months, as planning progressed, the budget grew. A destination component in Tuscany, in addition to the primary reception. A designer gown flown in from Paris with its own dedicated fitting trip. A guest list that expanded from a modest 200 to just over 400. Many of them people I'd never met, friends of Vanessa's from a world of luxury event planning I'd only ever glimpsed from the outside.
By the time all the invoices were finalized, the total came to $2,300,000, a number that even now still catches slightly in my throat when I say it out loud. I want you to understand, I never once said no. Not to a single line item, not to the Parisian gown, not to the Tuscany extension, not to a florist who charged $18,000 for arrangements that would be discarded within 48 hours. I told myself throughout the entire process that I was giving my son the wedding I hadn't been able to give him, the kind of childhood he deserved. Though one could somehow retroactively balance the other, as though enough zeros on an invoice could quietly settle an account that had never actually been about money to begin with. My accountant, a steady, no-nonsense man named Frank, who'd handled my books for over 20 years, asked me once, gently, during the height of the planning, whether I'd considered setting any kind of limit. I remember laughing off the question at the time, telling him it was a wedding, not a business decision, and that some things simply couldn't be budgeted the way we budgeted facilities contracts. Looking back, I think Frank saw, long before I did, exactly what direction all of this was heading. I noticed things during the planning process that I chose not to examine too closely at the time. Vanessa referred to me, in conversations with her own mother that I occasionally overheard, as Tyler's mom, rather than by my name. A small thing, perhaps, but one that struck me as odd given how much of the celebration existed because of my involvement. When vendors asked to confirm final approvals, those confirmations increasingly came from Vanessa directly, even for expenses I was personally covering, as though my role had quietly shifted, somewhere in the process, from benefactor to... I also noticed, with growing unease, that Tyler had gone strangely quiet during most of these exchanges. He'd been an assertive, opinionated child, and a reasonably assertive young man in most areas of his life. But somewhere in the wedding planning process, he seemed to defer entirely to Vanessa's preferences, rarely pushing back, rarely advocating for anything, including, I noticed, rarely advocating for my own presence in decisions about an event I was fully financing. I brought this up with him once, gently, over lunch about 2 months before the wedding. Tyler, I don't need to be involved in every decision, but I'd like to at least be consulted on things, given the scale of what we're talking about. He looked uncomfortable, glanced down at his plate, and said something that, in hindsight, told me more than I wanted to know at the time. Mom, Vanessa just really has a vision for this, and I think it's easier if we let her run with it. You know how she gets when things don't go exactly the way she's planned. I let it go. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me was still operating from that old guilt, still believing that funding my son's happiness, however that happiness manifested, was the closest thing to atonement I had access to for the years I'd spent building a company instead of attending every recital. The wedding took place in early June at a sprawling vineyard estate 2 hours outside the city. The kind of venue that requires booking 18 months in advance and costs more per hour than most people's monthly salary. I arrived early, wearing a dress I'd had custom-made after Vanessa specifically requested I coordinate with what she called the quiet elegance of the color palette. Sage green and ivory. Understated, expensive in the particular way that looks effortless. The ceremony itself was beautiful, genuinely, and I found myself crying during the vows,
The ordinary kind of crying any mother might do, watching her only child commit himself to someone he loved. For those few minutes, I let myself simply be happy, setting aside the small accumulated frictions of the previous 8 months. The reception began, and I found myself, over the following hour, increasingly aware of exactly where I'd been seated. Not at the family table near the head of the room, but at a table near the back, close to the kitchen entrance, seated among Vanessa's extended relatives I'd met perhaps twice in 4 years, while Vanessa's parents sat prominently near the center, close to Tyler and Vanessa themselves. I told myself it was an oversight. Wedding seating charts are complicated, I reminded myself, and perhaps there was some logistical reason I hadn't considered. About 2 hours into the reception, walking toward the restroom near the kitchen entrance, I passed close to where Vanessa was speaking with the wedding planner, a clipboard-carrying woman I'd met a handful of times during the planning process. Neither of them noticed me approaching, the noise of the reception covering my footsteps on the stone patio. "What about the photo with the extended family?" the planner was asking. "Should we pull Tyler's Myra in for that group shot, or just keep it to close family?"
Just seat her wherever. She's basically a useless guest at this point, Vanessa said, not lowering her voice nearly enough for the words to stay private. She already served her purpose. Honestly, I don't even know why Tyler insisted on inviting his old business associates from her cleaning company days. Half of them look completely out of place here anyway.
I stood there for a long moment, the sounds of the reception continuing around me, a string quartet playing something elegant and utterly indifferent to what I just heard. Served her purpose, as though I were a vendor whose invoice had been paid in full and whose continued presence was now, at best, a logistical inconvenience. I want to tell you what I did next, because I think it surprised everyone at that reception, including, eventually, myself. I didn't make a scene immediately. I walked back to my table, sat down, and finished the glass of wine in front of me, giving myself exactly the time I needed to think clearly rather than react from raw hurt. And then I did something I hadn't planned when I woke up that morning, but that felt, once the idea arrived, entirely correct. I found the venue's event coordinator, a calm, professional woman named Rosalind, who I'd worked with directly throughout the planning process, since after all, I was the one whose account had funded every deposit. I asked her a simple question. "Rosalind, the remaining balance on tonight's event and the Tuscany component next month, has the final payment been processed yet, or is there still an outstanding invoice?" She checked her records and confirmed there was, in fact, a remaining balance of just under $400,000, due within 30 days, covering the final vendor payments and the entirety of the destination component still to come. "I need you to hold that invoice," I told her. "Don't process any further payments from my account until you hear directly from me." I want to be clear about what I was doing and what I wasn't doing. I wasn't trying to ruin my son's wedding day, which was already, at that point, largely complete and paid for. I was simply, finally, drawing a line around what I was willing to continue funding without so much as basic acknowledgement of my own humanity in the process. I found Tyler about 20 minutes later, pulling him aside near the edge of the dance floor, away from the crowd, the string quartet still playing somewhere behind us, oblivious to the conversation about to unfold a few feet away. I told him, calmly, exactly what I'd overheard. I watched his face go through the particular kind of collapse a person's face does when they're forced to confront something about their spouse they've been quietly avoiding for months. "Mom, I'm sure she didn't mean it like..." "Tyler," I said, I've spent $2.3 million making sure your wedding day was everything Vanessa envisioned. I sat at a table near the kitchen. I wasn't consulted on a single decision in 8 months of planning. And 20 minutes ago, I heard your wife tell a wedding planner that I'd served my purpose and was now a useless guest. I need you to understand that I'm not upset about the seating chart. I'm upset that somewhere in the last 2 years, you've allowed me to become someone whose only value in this family is financial.
He didn't have an immediate answer. I don't think he'd fully processed until that exact moment, standing at the edge of his own wedding reception, exactly how far things had drifted. There's a detail from that reception I haven't told you yet, one that matters as much to me as the overheard comment itself. About an hour after my conversation with Tyler at the edge of the dance floor, Vanessa's own mother, a soft-spoken woman named Carol, who I'd only really spoken with a handful of times during the planning process, found me at my table near the kitchen and sat down beside me without saying anything at first. "I heard what happened," she finally said. "Vanessa told me, thinking I'd be on her side, and I need you to know I'm not." She reached over and took my hand, an oddly intimate gesture from someone I barely knew. "I raised that girl to work hard for everything she has, and somewhere in the last few years, being around money she didn't earn herself changed something in her that I don't fully recognize anymore. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve to be treated like a vendor at your own son's wedding." I want to tell you what that moment did for me, because in some ways it mattered as much as anything Tyler eventually said. It was the first genuine acknowledgement from anyone in Vanessa's family that something had gone quietly wrong over the previous 8 months. And it gave me a strange, unexpected comfort in the middle of an otherwise painful evening. The knowledge that at least one other person in that room had been watching closely enough to see it too. I want to tell you what happened over the following weeks, because the resolution here took longer and was more complicated than anything that happened in that single conversation. I didn't cancel the Tuscany trip outright, not immediately. What I did instead was inform Tyler, calmly and clearly, that the remaining $400,000 would only be released once I received a genuine, direct conversation with both him and Vanessa about the dynamic that had developed. Not a scripted apology delivered for the sake of unlocking funds, but an honest reckoning with how I'd been treated throughout the process. Vanessa, understandably, was furious when Tyler told her about the held payment. Their conversation, which Tyler later described to me in painful detail, was the first real fight of their marriage, 4 days into it, centering entirely on whether Vanessa had, in fact, spent the better part of a year treating her mother-in-law as a walking checkbook rather than a person. The conversation we eventually had, about 2 weeks after the wedding, was not comfortable. Vanessa's initial instinct was defensiveness. She hadn't meant it the way it sounded. She was stressed. Wedding planning brings out the worst in everyone. Surely I understood that. I listened to all of it, patiently, and then I told her the truth, as plainly as I could manage. "Vanessa, I don't need you to love me. I don't even need you to particularly like me. But I do need you to understand that the $2.3 million I gave to make your wedding day everything you wanted came from 38 years of a life you know almost nothing about. Years of cleaning office floors at 2 in the morning with my son asleep in a crib beside me. Years of building something out of absolutely nothing so that someday my family would never have to struggle the way I once did. That history doesn't disappear just because the check cleared. I am not a vendor you've..."
I released the remaining funds about a week later, once I felt genuinely satisfied that both Tyler and Vanessa understood what had actually been said, and more importantly, understood it wasn't simply about hurt feelings from one overheard comment, but about an entire pattern that had been allowed to develop unchecked over many months. It's been 8 months since the wedding. Things are better, though I won't pretend they're fully resolved, or that they ever will be in the way things were before all of this happened. Vanessa makes a genuine effort now, including me in decisions in a way she never did during the wedding planning, asking my opinion on things even when, I suspect, she doesn't particularly want it, simply because she understands now that not asking carries consequences she isn't willing to risk again. There was a moment, about 4 months after the wedding, that I think genuinely marked a turning point between us. Vanessa called me, unprompted, to ask my opinion about a career decision, a job offer from a competing event planning firm that would have meant more money but significantly less creative control. It was a small thing on its face, but it was the first time in our entire relationship that she'd sought my perspective on something that had nothing to do with what I could fund. We talked for almost an hour. I told her honestly that money without creative satisfaction had never once made me happier in 38 years of building a company, and that she should think carefully about what she actually wanted her days to feel like, not just what they'd pay. She ended up declining the offer. She told me afterward that our conversation had been part of what helped her decide, and I'll admit that meant more to me than any apology she could have offered directly. Tyler and I have had several long conversations since then about that old guilt I carried, the one that shaped so many of my decisions during his childhood, and apparently well into his adult life. Some of those conversations happened over the phone, late at night, the way we used to talk when he was in college and homesick, in a way he never quite admitted directly. Others happened in person, at the same kitchen table in my house, where I'd once done paperwork for the business at 2 in the morning after his bedtime. A table that has, over the decades, held more difficult conversations than I ever expected a simple piece of furniture to hold. He told me something during one of those conversations that I've thought about often since. "Mom, I never once resented you for those missed recitals. I resented, for a long time, watching you try to buy back time you never actually owed me in the first place. I would have rather had you there, imperfect and tired, than have you feel like you owed me anything at all." I think about that conversation more than I think about the wedding itself, honestly. $2.3 million taught me plenty about my son's marriage, about the woman he chose to spend his life with, about the patterns I'd let calcify over decades without ever fully examining them. But that one sentence from Tyler taught me something I probably needed to hear 25 years earlier, back when I was still mopping floors at 2 in the morning, still believing that love and generosity were the same thing, and that the size of what I gave could somehow substitute for the version of presence I couldn't always manage to provide. One last thing I want to share with you, because I think it says more about where things stand now than anything else in this story could. Last month, Tyler and Vanessa hosted a small dinner at their new house. Just the 3 of us. Nothing elaborate. Homemade pasta and a bottle of wine Vanessa picked because she remembered from some passing comment months earlier that it was my favorite. At one point in the evening, Vanessa raised her glass and said simply, "To the woman who built everything that made tonight possible, and who deserved to hear that a long time before she had to overhear." It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't $2.3 million. but it was the first time in 4 years I felt like she actually saw me, not as a resource, not as an obligation, but as the person whose entire life's work had quietly made room for the both of them to build one of their own. I think about those early mornings often, still. The empty office buildings, the hum of the vacuum, Tyler's small breathing in that portable crib. I built everything I built so that my son would never have to know what it felt like to go without. I never once imagined that the harder lesson, the one that took 69 years and $2.3 million to fully learn, was that money can buy almost anything except the simple, ordinary respect of being seen as a whole person, rather than a source of funds. I'm grateful, finally, to have both. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever given everything to someone only to feel like your worth was reduced to what you could provide, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want to know what happened at Tyler and Vanessa's 1-year anniversary dinner and whether I was finally seated at the head table, that's a story too. Let me know. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.